This is a CBC News special report.
Good evening, I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto. The world is in shock after a series of audacious and devastating terror attacks on the United States. Many are calling it a declaration of war. Here is what we know. At 8:45 this morning, a hijacked commercial flight on its way from Boston to Los Angeles flew right into the North Tower of the landmark World Trade Center in New York. Flames and smoke poured out of the building almost 20 minutes later as millions of shocked television viewers watched live pictures of the World Trade Center. Another hijacked plane flew into the South Tower. More smoke and flames shot out of the building and debris fell on the streets below. Around 9:40, another explosion, this time in Washington. A third hijacked plane hit the interior of the Pentagon, the military nerve center of the United States. Part of the building collapsed and burst into flames. 10 minutes later, the most horrifying sight of all, the 110-story South Tower of the World Trade Center started to collapse. In seconds, the massive building was nothing but an immense cloud of dust, ash, and debris. But the terror wasn't over. Around 10:10 a.m., another hijacked commercial aircraft crashed outside Pittsburgh. Shortly after that, there were reports of an explosion outside the U.S. State Department. As distraught Americans tried to take it all in, the remaining tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, showering debris over a wide area, turning the lower part of Manhattan into a disaster zone. Thousands are dead and injured. The skyline of New York and the psyche of the American population has been forever changed. Now, the World Trade Center was the site of a bomb attack back in 1993 that killed 6 people and injured 1,000 more. But the havoc wreaked today was much, much worse. Reporter Steve Irwin is in New York City.
Nothing that has ever happened before could prepare New Yorkers for this. A surreal scene that began just before 9 this morning. Smoke pouring from one of the towers of the World Trade Center. A plane had just flown straight into the building. It was an American Airlines flight from Boston to Los Angeles, hijacked with 92 people aboard. Fires were burning, debris was falling, and before the shock could wear off, the whole horrible scene repeated itself.
There's another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God!
A second plane was hijacked, and as people around the world watched on television, it flew straight into the other tower, punching a hole through the building.
And I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. It had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
What went through your mind?
That it couldn't be real. Just that it couldn't be real.
We thought it was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism at that point.
There are typically some 50,000 people working every day in these 110-story buildings. Those inside began to flee while emergency workers rushed in a frenzy to the scene.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion, and everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped. Eventually, when the dust lifted, I saw some light and started screaming for everybody to go out towards the light.
As soon as you got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
Were there other people that were hurt, were lying
there? There was a lot of people hurt. They were lying on the floors, coming down the stairs. A lot of people had asthma attacks while they were coming down. It was bad.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Well, the firefighter, somebody with little light came eventually, and we were following him.
And go to.
What did you do? I'm sorry.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. Do you want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
But then, an even greater catastrophe. The South Tower, its structure weakened by the plane, collapsed on itself. Unbelievably, a half hour later, that scene too repeated itself. Floor after floor of falling debris. Billowing smoke and soot seem to cover the lower portion of Manhattan Island. It's impossible even to guess right now at how many casualties there were in this attack. But it's easy to see in the faces of New Yorkers that it will be a very long time before life here returns to normal. For CBC News, I'm Steve Irwin in New York.
Well, all day, the expectation has been how long would it take Americans to retaliate against this? We're not sure if this is it, but we can show you once again pictures from Kabul, Afghanistan, where there is definitely something going on. A number of networks reporting now that there are explosions around the city of Kabul, Afghanistan, around the outskirts. This may well be a fuel depot. It was hit a few moments ago and still very much in flames. Rockets, tracer fire have all been noticed. Multiple explosions around the city and fires burning on the edge of the city of Kabul, Afghanistan. Is this the American response? We do not know. How are these attacks taking place, if in fact they are attacks on the capital of Afghanistan? We do not know at this hour. But clearly something is going on there, and Kabul, Afghanistan in particular has been the country that many suspect has been harboring the terrorist Osama bin Laden, who many are suggesting may well have been responsible for the attacks in the United States today. All this still to be determined, this going on in Afghanistan right now. We will be watching it throughout our broadcast and keep you up to date as soon as we can tell you something definitive on what is happening in Afghanistan. Well, as the horror of New York was still just starting to sink in, reports started coming in from Washington of explosions and fireballs. Then the chilling news that a commercial jet had crashed into the Pentagon, the military nerve center of the United States. And it didn't end there. The CBC's Adrienne Arsenault joins us for that story. Adrienne.
Well, Peter, this is supposed to be rush hour in Washington, but the city has somewhat of an abandoned feel now after a state of emergency was declared and hundreds of thousands of people were sent home in the panic of this unbelievable day.
Before their eyes, the terror of New York just flew into their backyard. At 9:45 a.m., an explosion at the Pentagon.
And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked right.
The military nerve center of the United States, workplace of more than 20,000 people under attack. A hijacked American Airlines 757 with 64 people on board had just left Dulles, Virginia, en route to Los Angeles. Then it changed course and crashed into the West Wing. All 5 floors collapsed.
And an enormous gap has been cut in this building.
In Florida, at an education event, the horror was just reaching the president. He left almost immediately, but not before issuing a warning.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
Bush, his family, and key members of his staff were taken to secure locations, kept for the most part out of the public eye. The United States military, at home and overseas, was put on the highest alert. The White House, the Capitol building, all emptied out. And by mid-morning, every federal building in Washington was evacuated, sending 250,000 people into the streets. Across town, early, unconfirmed reports of an explosion at or near the State Department. On any other day, that would be crisis enough. Here, today, it just gets added to a horrible list.
Very angry. Very angry that somebody has such callous disregard for human life.
And it would continue. Just before noon, a fourth commercial jet crashed just outside Pittsburgh. A passenger aboard the United Airlines plane had called police to report a hijacking, only moments before it went down in a cornfield.
I happened to heard a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
By now, for the first time ever, every plane was grounded in the United States. Nothing will be flying into or out of here until at least noon Wednesday. Many of these orders from the U.S. President directly, who appeared briefly in Louisiana, shaken and livid.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
In all the panic, there were few moments to talk or think of blame. But immediately, many wondered if this was the horrific handiwork of Islamic fundamentalist and fugitive Osama bin Laden. A hastily put together news conference from Afghanistan denied any involvement.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out in this incident.
Now, many politicians, many law enforcement officials here have been jumping to conclusions about who was responsible for this. Some saying they really do believe bin Laden is behind it. But by late afternoon, the FBI was saying that it was still waiting for someone or some group to claim responsibility for these attacks.
Well,
Peter?
Adrian, as you're probably aware of now, nobody seems to have waited too long in Kabul, Afghanistan. Somebody is attacking the Afghani capital right now, and one only has to assume that it may be part of an American response, as the reports of rockets coming in over the city, missiles, whether they're cruise missiles or not, we don't know. You mentioned a state of emergency is to be declared in Washington. Can you tell us what that exactly means?
Sure. Well, for right now, what it means is that all fire, police, and emergency medical personnel are expected to report for duty. We have seen convoys of, obviously, emergency vehicles moving through the streets, as well as military vehicles. We understand as well, and I don't know whether you've seen or heard it, but there are F-16s patrolling the skies in Washington right now. And as we understand, their orders are that if planes enter restricted airspace and they cannot urge them out, that they are to shoot them down.
All right. CBC's Adrian Arsenault in Washington. A city filled with chaos and fear after the very heart of the U.S. government came under attack. Now, with more on how that government is responding to the attacks, here's our chief Washington correspondent, David Holton. David, what do we know at this hour about what's going on in Kabul?
Still no official confirmation, Peter, that this is a U.S. retaliation for the terrorist bombings in the U.S. today. But U.S. officials have warned for many, many months that if there's another major terrorist attack against the U.S., that the Taliban government in Afghanistan would be held accountable. These warnings have been made in the past, and with events like today's, it seems that it may have confirmed the U.S. worst fears and would appear to have set these strikes in motion. It also explains, perhaps, Peter, why, and it was a bit of a mystery earlier in the day, why President Bush flew out to the Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. No one could quite figure out why he'd gone. This would appear to confirm why he went there, to order and, in fact, to supervise the strikes. Now, we may have to wait until Bush's address later this evening before we get an official confirmation that there has, in fact, been U.S. retaliation launched.
You know, there are all day today, this afternoon, and you and I have discussed it a number of times, the sort of unofficial word coming out that of the finger pointing at Osama bin Laden, but there's still, as you say, there has been no official word that the Americans are pointing direct blame at bin Laden for this.
No, unofficially, sources have said early in the afternoon that there were indications, they said, some indications that bin Laden's organization Al-Qaeda was in fact involved, but they confirmed that these were just suspicions at this point. A number of officials here feel that only bin Laden's organization Al-Qaeda has the kind of sophistication and the resources to launch this kind of incredibly well-coordinated series of attacks today. But no reason given for what they suspect the timing could be. Embassy. Some officials were saying earlier today, noting that on Wednesday of this week, a bin Laden associate who was going to be sentenced in New York for the 1998 terrorist attack on the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, and that this was coming up on Wednesday and that there might be an element of timing connected with that, but that again is pure speculation.
Well, that's right, David, and a lot of speculation going on at this hour, especially over what, in fact, is going on in Kabul. There's no doubt that there's some kind of attack underway, but the question is who is orchestrating it. There's a report now on the wires that suggests that it may be the Afghani opposition taking the situation into their own hands and beginning some form of attack in the Kabul area. So still a lot of confusion as to what's going on there as we look at the pictures as we did just a few moments ago. Clearly what looks like a fuel depot on the outskirts of Kabul is being in flames for some time, and there has been a number of video shots of both incoming and outgoing fire going on in the Kabul area. And more indications now that it's not necessarily a U.S. strike, that it may well be part of Afghanistan's civil war. So as you say, David, we should be show caution on this one here. David Halton reporting to us tonight from Washington, and David will be back to you later on. Well, the world is wondering how anyone could have caused this kind of devastation, and it's wondering who is behind it. Rex Brynan teaches political science at McGill University. He's a specialist in Middle East politics, counterterrorism, and conflict. He joins us from Montreal. Who would do this?
Well, there's a fairly lengthy list of people who might like to do this. I think the speculation that it might be Osama bin Laden is probably the best guess at this point as to who's responsible. It certainly bears many of the hallmarks of his kind of operation, the simultaneous targeting of two places, Washington, New York, is similar in some ways to the targeting of two U.S. embassies in Africa. So bin Laden has shown a lot of cleverness, a lot of ability to protect information and security within his organization. So I think he's the leading contender, but he's not necessarily the only contender, nor is it impossible that it's a new network one we haven't previously heard of, and in a sense was under the radar screen from an intelligence point of view.
Now, as you suggested, these were incredibly well coordinated, well organized. How could any group manage something like this?
Well, they were smart. I'm not sure that they require much in the way of sophisticated, complicated infrastructure. What they required was some very smart targeting from a symbolic point of view. You know, the center of U.S. military power, the Pentagon, the center of U.S. economic power, the financial district of New York. It required casing out the joint, understanding something about airport security. It required simultaneous penetration of apparently multiple airports in order to hijack 4 aircraft. It apparently required multiple hijackers on each aircraft. We don't know yet what weapons they used to hijack those aircraft. A lot of that requires brain power. It requires thinking about things. It requires careful planning. It requires compartmentalization of knowledge. It requires operatives in the field who don't blab, who don't talk about what they're doing, who know not to talk about it on telephone conversations and cell phone conversations over the internet. It requires discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much speculation about bin Laden, because his organization has simply shown more cleverness and more discipline than many others. Are there any other organizations that could have been responsible given that high level of organization and secrecy that was needed? I think there are other groups in the Middle East who might like to do this. I think there are other places in the world, in the Balkans, for example, where there are grievances against U.S. foreign policy. There might even be domestic groups in the United States, and we all have to remember how all the speculation was about Middle East terrorism when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, only to find out that it was domestic terrorism. So there are a number of other possibilities, but certainly bin Laden is a leading contender, a reasonable contender at this point. Now, the United States government seems to have been taken by surprise on this. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us they had no specific credible threat of an impending terrorist attack. Now, one has to understand that there are threats of terrorist attacks every day emanating from the Middle East or elsewhere, and most of them obviously are not true and they're not credible. The real task from an intelligence point of view is to sift out, the kernel of truth from all the chaff of misinformation, and that is very difficult to do. Moreover, if you're trying to conduct this kind of attack, this appalling, devastating attack, What you try to do is you try to limit the number of people involved. You try to limit the amount of information. You try to prevent it from leaking out. You take measures to prevent penetration from intelligence agencies. You take measures to secure your communications. It is entirely possible that these attacks involved maybe a dozen to 2 dozen people total. And if none of those people are careless, then you can certainly organize an attack of this sort without the intelligence community necessarily having any advance warning.
What about response, reaction? How soon do you think it's going to take place by the United States? Obviously, something's going on in Kabul right now. We're not sure what it is and who may be the reason behind it. But do you expect the Americans to react fairly quickly on this?
I do, but the question is when they have very credible information as to who is responsible. Bin Laden's organization does not usually claim responsibility. Whatever support personnel are left over from this operation will have fled the United States, gone to ground. It may actually take some time before the United States is absolutely certain as to what the target is. There will be a great deal of political pressure on the Bush administration from a very angry and understandably angry United States to do something now. And Afghanistan and Bin Laden are reasonable targets given Bin Laden's proven track record of support for international terrorism. But the danger is that the U.S. might make mistakes. And we can remember the United States attacking targets in Afghanistan and Sudan that were associated with terrorism in the past with a cruise missile attack. And it turned out that the Sudanese target was not a chemical weapons factory. It was a pharmaceutical plant. And the U.S. simply had it wrong. So the danger is that there's intense pressure to do something. But in responding to that pressure and in wanting to demonstrate U.S. resolve, you make a mistake.
All right. Rex Brynan joining us from Montreal, professor at McGill University. We appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Okay,
we can now tell you that the Pentagon is denying that the United States has anything to do with these explosions that are taking place in the immediate area around Kabul. These are pictures that our friends at CNN have got to us, and these are taken by a video phone from Kabul. Something's going on there. There's no doubt about that. But the Pentagon is saying this is not a U.S. strike. This all happening in the last 15 minutes. They're also announcing from the Pentagon that the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, will be speaking shortly, giving a briefing. This, if it is a real briefing, it's going to be the first one by a high U.S. official throughout this day. And so we may first get our hands on some real hard information, at least in terms of what the Americans know about what happened today, beyond the obvious, and why it happened, and what, if anything, they are prepared to do about it. We will obviously cover that live. Well, the situation in Canada pales by comparison, but there are security fears here and major upheavals as well. We start at the airports. They are under an unprecedented strain. There is no traffic going out. All flights are canceled. But all day, planes were coming in, diverted from U.S. destinations. Security is tight, and as the CBC's Ron Charles reports, resources are being tested like never before.
With no commercial aircraft allowed over the U.S., planes that had been on their way there from overseas are being diverted to airports in Canada. That means finding room for up to 500 unexpected aircraft. Airlines in Canada canceled their flights and parked their planes to free up space.
We have effectively closed Pearson Airport to normal operations at this point. So scheduled flights in and out of the airport effectively have not been happening today and will not likely happen for the rest of the day.
And so the only planes landing at Pearson Airport were those diverted from the U.S. Pearson plans to accept 25 of the diverted planes. The airport in Halifax was prepared for 50. Planes that had been bound for the U.S. were lined up on a closed runway there, while the RCMP performed a security sweep of each aircraft. Other security was extremely tight at the country's airports. Diverted passengers spent hours waiting to get off the planes.
We were going to San Francisco, but unfortunately we've come to Calgary instead.
The cancellation of flights across North America left thousands of travelers stranded at Canadian airports, and the events in the U.S. left them stunned.
Total shock and disbelief. Sounds like something out of a movie.
It's unbelievable. Until I see that on the news, it hasn't hit. I just can't believe it. It's not real.
I think it's a disgrace, and I think President Bush should act immediately, without hesitation, of the Pentagon, and nuke every terrorist state in the world.
Air Canada announced that the hijacked plane that crashed outside Pittsburgh was a flight the airline shares with United Airlines. But Air Canada officials say they have no record of any of their passengers on board the plane. Ron Charles, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, CBC's Terry Malefsky is at the Vancouver airport watching the security operation and talking to worried travelers. Terry, what are you hearing?
Peter, there's been a logistical nightmare all day here in Vancouver. It's the only major Canadian airport on the West Coast, obviously, and there's a tremendous volume of trans-Pacific aviation which has been diverted here. We've got now something like 34 large jets, jumbo jets, 747s, 767s, Air China, Japan Airlines. We've got flights from Honolulu, from Manila. People had no idea they were coming here. Thousands of people, in fact, about 5,000, maybe 6,000 passengers here under intense security. I've spoken just a moment ago to a gentleman with the U.S. military based in Japan on his way to Kansas City by way of Vancouver and Minneapolis, and he says that he's taken 5.5 hours from touchdown after circling, waiting for landing for an hour, then an hour and a half on the ground, then once he's out of the plane, 4 hours trying to get through immigration and security, and he still doesn't have his bags. They're not giving these passengers their bags now. Look, we'll search them later. You go to a hotel. You go to Seattle. A lot of them being put on buses to Seattle if they're heading for the United States, and we'll send your bags on later. It's been a logistical nightmare, and the key question has been they want to check every single one of these passengers because they don't know if there might have been another hijacker on some other plane. Maybe he chickened out. They want to search all the bags because if they do find some other phantom hijacker who didn't perform his mission, then that will be the only live one they get. So far, though, it's been a smooth operation, although a slow one, and the security hasn't turned up any surprises. But this nightmare of logistics, buses, and delays seems set to continue long through this evening, Peter.
All right, Terry, thanks very much. Terry Malefsky in Vancouver. Well, security is as tight as it's ever been at every border crossing between Canada and the U.S. as authorities pore over the identification of every traveler. The CBC's Ian Hannah-Mansing has more on the view from the borders. Ian.
Well, Peter, I'm at what is officially known as the Douglas border crossing, about a 45-minute drive south of Vancouver. Most people here, though, refer to it as the Peace Arch crossing. That is the Peace Arch monument behind me. What you can't see is atop that monument about a half hour ago, someone came and put the two flags, the U.S. and Canadian flag, at half-mast, half-staff to mark the events of today. This is usually the third busiest vehicle crossing between Canada and the United States, but a much different, much quieter scene here today. Inscribed on the side of the Peace Arch, this monument to the world's longest undefended border, are the words, "May this gate never be closed." But entry to the United States was sealed shut for about 20 minutes this morning, and when the border reopened, there was heavy security. U.S. citizens were allowed slowly back into their country. Most non-Americans were turned away. These Canadians were headed to Oregon for a convention.
And then he said, "I'm sorry, you cannot go through the very easy thing. Only Americans are allowed to go through."
On the Canadian side, heightened security as well. And at a crossing where usually more than 300 cars an hour would stream past, by midday, only about 75 vehicles each hour were trickling through. One veteran police officer said he's never seen this level of security at the border.
I've been policing in this area for over the course of 35 years. As far as on an emergent reaction, no, I've never encountered this type of slowdown.
It was a similar scene at some of the other major crossings. The Windsor-Detroit Tunnel was shut down for about 5 hours. And on the Ambassador Bridge, massive backups. At Niagara Falls, no complaints about the slow traffic, but outrage from Americans over the attacks.
Whoever did it, I hope they really get the crap knocked out of them. I mean, they will, because the Americans stand together.
It's a sad day for America. Still proud to be an American. But we need to straighten this out real quick and go after the parties. All-out war, that's what it is, just like Pearl Harbor.
Peter, here at the Peace Arch crossing, indeed at all the border crossings between Canada and the United States, the American officials have invoked what they call Code 1 security, the highest, as you can imagine, of 4 levels. The last time they invoked this level of security was in December 1999, the eve of the Millennium celebrations, when Ahmed Rassam was intercepted with explosives trying to get from British Columbia into Washington State. And by the way, the word of the security measures here and how long it could take to get across has obviously gotten out. At this hour, about 3 o'clock, just past 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in British Columbia, fewer than a dozen cars trying to get into each each the United States and Canada. Peter?
All right, Ian, thanks very much. Ian Hannamansing reporting from the BC-Washington state border. Well, in Ottawa tonight, tension, apprehension, and offers of sympathy to the U.S. Prime Minister Chrétien said the government had beefed up security here in the wake of the attacks, and across the national capital, signs that this country is indeed taking security very seriously. Our chief political correspondent, Jason Moskowitz, joins us now. Jason.
Peter, the Prime Minister began his day with Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert. They were having a breakfast meeting. They were discussing the farming crisis in Western Canada when they were interrupted with news of the horrific events in the U.S. What started as a normal day on Parliament Hill soon became a day of heightened security. The barricades went up, visitors were asked to leave. Cabinet ministers across the country tried to get up to speed. That was especially the case for Lawrence MacAulay, the minister responsible for the RCMP.
Of course, I don't have the in-depth detail of every step that the Security Intelligence Agency take, but obviously we have a very strong security intelligence teams in the U.S. and in this country. Obviously, there's been a desperate, terrifying act of terrorism that we will all have to deal with.
In the early afternoon, Prime Minister Chrétien expressed sympathy from all Canadians.
Canadians will show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come are when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic.
Chrétien then talked of Canadian security measures but stayed away from specifics.
We have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and everybody has increased the level of security everywhere.
Heightened security was evident over Whitehorse this afternoon. Canadian fighter jets tracked a Korean plane. There were fears of a possible hijacking, but in the end the plane reported problems because of a fuel shortage, the result of circling for too long. In Toronto, Premier Mike Harris offered all the medical help his province could muster.
I have instructed all branches of the provincial government that Ontario will provide whatever support is needed.
Alberta Premier Ralph Klein wondered if the G8 summit scheduled for his province next June should be cancelled.
It's my personal thought that it would be absolute folly to proceed with a summit of that magnitude.
The Chrétien cabinet didn't meet today. With cabinet ministers across the country, with airports closed, they couldn't get to Ottawa. The Prime Minister says he spoke to many of them on the telephone. Peter?
Jason, did he speak to George Bush on the telephone today?
Well, he told us that he put a call in. Understandably, as far as we know at this moment, they haven't spoken yet.
All right, Jason Moskowitz in the nation's capital. Well, as you heard, Ottawa moved quickly in the wake of the attacks. Police forces in the national capital were moved to high alert. Some embassies were shut, and there were special precautions at one of the most visible U.S. properties in Ottawa. Here's Paul Hunter.
It's the biggest and most important U.S. government building in Canada. And so today at the American Embassy in Ottawa, they took no chances. All non-essential workers were told to leave.
Sir, can we get your reaction to what's going on inside? No comment right now, thank you.
And those who work nearby wondered, could the U.S. Embassy be a target?
I'm really scared. I want to go as far away from here as possible.
It set the tone for the day in Ottawa, where some roads were briefly blocked off, tourists told to leave the area.
Yes, can we evacuate there?
Yeah.
We have been asked by the police to evacuate the west.
Even the Chateau Laurier Hotel was evacuated because of a brief bomb scare. And like its other embassies around the world, Israel's, in this Ottawa office building, was evacuated too. So were nearby offices.
Just sheer relief fell over the whole office.
Police doubled their numbers on the streets. Hospitals and ambulances were put on alert. The RCMP says it's doing all it can.
But I can assure you we are doing everything possible to gather the very best intelligence so that we can use that intelligence to respond appropriately to whatever threat there is to Canadians and obviously other embassies and so on in Canada.
Of course, after all the worries, the evacuations, the extra police, nothing terrible happened in Ottawa. But on this day, no one's complaining about all the extra precautions. Better that than the now all too imaginable possibilities. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, the Canadian Blood Services say they're expecting a huge demand from the United States for blood donations. To find out the location of clinics and hours of operation, you can call 1-888-2-DONATE. And to check on Canadians who may have been caught in the attacks, Foreign Affairs has a 24-hour emergency service. That number is 1-800-387-3124. Be advised, both numbers are extremely busy. Well, obviously, attacks like these were enormous enough to shake the globe, and the reaction was swift. Most world leaders closed ranks with the United States, condemning the violence with a mixture of deep sorrow and absolute horror. Don Murray has been tracking events today in Europe. He joins us now from London. Don.
Peter, the countries of Europe have spent a generation dealing with terror attacks on their territories, far more than in the U.S., but nothing at all. They've never seen anything like today's attacks. The world watched transfixed. This was London. It could have been any major city in Europe this afternoon. Television pictures gathered crowds. They evoked curiosity, disbelief, and then horror. Traders were moved from the London Stock Exchange. They too watched the televised pictures in disbelief. Some left one of London's main financial office buildings. American firms sent their workers home. Rapidly, police forces around the continent were put on alert. Security was noticeably heavier at the American embassy in London. By the end of the afternoon, the impact was most obvious at airports. London's Heathrow was filled with passengers whose planes, headed for the U.S., had been turned back in the air. The chorus of condemnation from European political leaders was swift and unanimous. Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schröder talked of the revulsion his government and his country felt at these attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the attacks as an evil blow against all civilized people.
То, что произошло сегодня, лишний раз подчеркивает актуальность.
What happened today, he says, underlines the importance of Russia's proposal to unite all the forces of international society to fight terrorism. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair emerged from an emergency meeting of his senior ministers to say his country would stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in a crusade to eliminate such attacks.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
Tonight, NATO ambassadors met in Brussels just hours after all non-essential personnel were sent home from the alliance's headquarters. And tomorrow, European Union foreign ministers will meet in emergency session. But all of this furious flurry of diplomatic discussion barely disguises the obvious, that no one in power in Europe really knows how this happened and what will happen next. Peter?
Don, we're trying to keep obviously monitoring the situation in Kabul tonight, and the latest pictures we've seen, there's still indications of fires going on around the city there, but there is a firm denial now from the United States that it has anything to do with whatever's going on in Kabul. It's unclear. It appears to be a fuel depot, and there has been indications that there was fire, perhaps missile fire, around the city. Now, there are suggestions now that it may be the Afghan opposition involved in attacking the capital of that country. What can you tell us about the situation in Afghanistan, not at this hour, but in general terms of the disagreements and the tension between the opposition and the government in Afghanistan?
Well, the government has been, if you will, offering shelter to Osama bin Laden, and it went out of its way today to suggest that there was no way that his group would have the resources. It was being watched by the government, that it wouldn't be in a position and would not be allowed to be in a position to undertake such attacks. Having said that, the opposition in Afghanistan, which is, if you wish, pushed into one corner of the Panjshir Valley, has been trying to mount attacks and probably looks upon today's events as a possibility, an opening to launch a minor offensive against the government, the Taliban government, which it has to be said controls 80–90% of the territory, but may see itself today as potentially very much on the defensive. It clearly is trying to distance itself from any association with any potential finger being pointed at Osama bin Laden and his group as the perpetrators of these attacks in the United States.
All right, Don. Thanks very much. Don Murray joining us from our bureau in London. Well, now to the Middle East, where pockets of Palestinians held celebrations after today's terror attacks. But in most of the region, there is only shock. The CBC's Middle East correspondent, Neil MacDonald, joins us with the latest. Neil.
Peter, the mood here in Jerusalem, and I think it's safe to say in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Arab world, is a somber one. There's a feeling here of great foreboding. If, and I say if, these attacks were perpetrated by Arab extremists, then Israel is inevitably drawn into the equation, as are the Palestinians and other Arab states. For the past year, especially since the election of President Bush, Israel and the United States of America have become synonymous in the mind of the Arab street. To a great many Arabs, both countries are now bitter enemies, and that explains some of the scenes we saw here today. In Arab East Jerusalem, groups of people took to the street, celebrating, toasting Osama bin Laden, and generally hailing whomever managed to inflict such a lethal blow against Israel's closest ally and greatest protector. There were similar celebrations in the cities of the West Bank and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon. Most Arab leaders, though, understanding the sheer foolishness of taunting Americans at a time like this, were greatly restrained.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Palestinian extremist groups, though, issued cold denials and took the opportunity to lecture the United States. We are opposed to U.S. oppression, said this leader of Hamas, itself a group that has dispatched suicide bombers. We call upon the U.S. to take fair stands and not take Israel's side.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
Israeli leaders universally expressed grief and condolences. Israel's Foreign Minister Shimon Peres says it pains Israel's heart and urged the world to organize against what he called terror, saying several countries are known to be terror centers, and the world must not leave them free to play with people's lives. I hope the world understands today that its first enemy is Islamic terror, said Israel's defense minister. On the popular Israeli political program Popolitica, an Israeli general called for the immediate liquidation of Yasser Arafat.
What the American people
and from a former prime minister,
we here in Israel have been standing and fighting at the front line against terrorism for years, but now terrorism is struck at the heart of freedom. And this is exactly what this battle is. It's a battle between the forces of tyranny and terrorism and the forces of freedom and democracy.
And that is doubtless how the Arabs of the Middle East fear the lines will be drawn from now on, with them cast irretrievably as terrorists and the word Islam synonymous with atrocity in the Western mind. It's probably fair to say that most people here, Arab and Jew, believe their lives changed today and that the geopolitical lines here have shifted radically. Certainly, the current Palestinian uprising with its overt Islamic dimension is going to be seen in quite a different light, beginning tomorrow. Peter?
Neil MacDonald reporting to us tonight from Jerusalem. Late in the day, there was more reaction from Israel. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced a national day of mourning tomorrow. He also said all of Israel's border crossings have been closed for security reasons. Let's go live to Washington now. The briefing has begun by Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary in the United States, at the Pentagon, which itself was under attack today. Here's Donald Rumsfeld.
Earlier today and offered his support and was kind enough to come down and has been with us. We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army, Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is it's not possible to have solid casualty figures at this time. And the various components are doing roster checks, and we'll have information at some point in the future, and as quickly as it's possible to have it, it will certainly be made available to each of you. I'll be happy to take a few questions after asking First General Shelton if he would like to say anything, and then we will allow the others to make a remark or two.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people, acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history, and yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act, a series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions and then we'll adjourn. Charlie.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all, in any way, that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Mr. Secretary, you said you could not be specific about casualties. Can you give us some characterization of whether it's dozens or hundreds in the building?
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens, in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between, I think, the first and second floor of the opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension. There are a number of people that they've not identified by name, but identified as being dead, and there are a number of casualties. But the FBI has secured the site, and the information takes time to come. People have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
Mr. Secretary, could you tell us what you saw?
Mr. Secretary, do you consider what happened today, both in New York and here, an act of war?
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America. What words the lawyers will use to characterize it is for them.
Does that mean that the U.S. is at war then?
Mr. Secretary, you said that the Pentagon would be open for business tomorrow. What kind of assurances can you give the people who work here at the building that the building will be safe?
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique. It is not possible to give guarantees. The people who work in this building do so voluntarily. They're brave people, and they do their jobs well.
Mr. Secretary, can you give a sense of what happened? What did you see when you left your office, ran down to the site, and apparently helped people on stretchers and then returned to the command center?
I felt the shock of the airplane hitting the building, went through the building and then out into the area, and they were bringing bodies out that had been injured, most of which were alive and moving, but seriously injured. And a lot of volunteers were doing a terrific job helping to bring them out of the buildings and get them into stretchers and into ambulances and into airlifts.
Secretary, can you tell us how many of the dead were soldiers and how many were civilians? Have you been able to determine that?
Absolutely not. Yes.
Mr. Secretary, today we saw military planes both in New York and in Washington. How much more of a military presence will we see now that this incident has occurred for the next week?
Those kinds of decisions are made day to day. It is correct that we had aircraft flying protective missions at various places in the United States today, and they will do that as appropriate.
Mr. Secretary, what do you say to the American people who may have questions on how something so coordinated has been carried out against this nation? What do you say to them who might not have confidence that our intelligence and our security are what they should be?
I say to them that the President of the United States will be making some remarks to them this evening that will address those subjects.
Mr. Secretary, you've declared, the Pentagon has declared ThreatCon Delta forces around the world. Could you tell me why? Have you received any threats, or has anyone claimed credit for this?
We have, in fact, declared Force Protection Condition Delta and a condition of high alert, indeed the highest alert. We did so almost immediately upon the attacks, and it is still in force.
Mr. Secretary, were there threats, issued against other U.S. facilities elsewhere in the world today?
I don't know that there's a day that's gone by since I've been in this job that there haven't been threats somewhere in the world to some facility somewhere. It's one of the complexities of the intelligence business that you have to sort through those kinds of things. But we don't get into the specifics. Yes. You had your hand up? Yes.
So, Mr. Secretary, there were rumors earlier in the day that the plane which crashed in Pennsylvania had been brought down by the United States, either shot down or brought down in some other manner.
We have absolutely no information that any U.S. aircraft shot down any other aircraft today.
I wonder if we could just ask Senator Levin one thing.
You bet.
That's all right. Senator Levin, you and other Democrats in Congress have voiced fears that you simply don't have enough money for the large increase in defense.
We'll continue to monitor this briefing coming out of the Pentagon. On the left of your screen, you see the helicopter carrying the President of the United States. It's called Marine One. It's the helicopter that's carrying the President. He's just flown back from Nebraska to Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington on Air Force One, and then switches over to the helicopter here to head in towards the White House. As you've heard, the Secretary of Defense still very sketchy on the details and being very careful about what he says about their suspicions of who may be been behind these attacks today on both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon building by hijacked aircraft. The President will be speaking in just a little over 2 hours' time, 9 o'clock Washington time, after his arrival here. The Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, suggesting that you will hear the President of the United States trying to tell the American people exactly what he knows, but also explaining to them that America is safe tonight, that all precautions have been taken to ensure that something like this could not happen again, and that air travel is being suspended, as we know, until noon, at least until noon hour tomorrow. You saw the escorts for the helicopters as the Marine One was bringing the President in. They're just waiting for the engines to slow down, although there's probably some conversations going on inside the helicopter here, whether the President's on the phone or not. Quite often you'll see those doors opening very quickly. Well, here we go. The President back on the ground. He'd left Washington for an engagement in Florida earlier this morning, and it was an education speech he had to give, and he was just about to give it when the first attack took place on the World Trade Center. And very quickly from there, when it was clear to them that this was no accident, they whisked the President away, took him to first Louisiana, then to Omaha. There he is, President George W. Bush, taking the salute from the Marine Guard outside the White House, heading towards the inside of the building. Let's listen in to see whether he'll have any comments going in. It's unusual that presidents do, but let's see if he does tonight. He will be speaking to the nation in 2 hours' time. For George W. Bush, clearly one of the most critical days of his presidency. How he handles this situation and how he responds to it will be measured by all of those, not only in his own country, but around the world. A lonely figure walking into the White House tonight, greeted by some of his staff. Karen Hughes there, one of his senior advisors. We heard from her earlier in the day. So there's the situation from the White House. The President is back home now in Washington. We'll be speaking from the White House in just over 2 hours' time now. We will, of course, be covering it live. Now, let me flip back to the Pentagon. Is that briefing over at this point? Well, we're just going to have a peek here. It appears that it's
Ladies and gentlemen,
it's all over in the Pentagon briefing. Donald Rumsfeld, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, giving his statement tonight to reporters and to his country people about exactly how the Defense Department has reacted to today's developments. He was inside the Pentagon when one of those hijacked aircraft slammed into their building. He would not venture an estimate in terms of how many casualties there were, but he made it very clear that it was not a few. There have been reports indicating that there may be as many as 100 dead at the Pentagon building in Washington. A staggering figure, but yet it probably pales in comparison to the kind of numbers we are being led to believe we should expect when the final toll is taken, and it could be weeks in New York City from the collapse of both towers at the World Trade Center after they too were struck